So, Anne-Marie, where was the first time we met?
Back in 2014, we met on a course run by Red R Australia down in Victoria to prepare people to be working in sort of more risky environments as humanitarians.
The heat course, hostile environment training. Wow, some crazy things happened there, didn't they? But we can't talk about it.
Very intense, very lifelike, but yes, we are under strict instructions not to share anything more, unfortunately.
No. Welcome to Collab, a podcast series about international development and crisis response issues and trends. Want to land a job at a big UN agency? We're in New York to get some tips. Anne-Marie Wilcock has lived this dream for over 13 years. She's been in Nepal, Palestine and Pakistan with agencies like UNDP, FAO and MSF. Currently, she's at the UN as an Advocacy Manager. Along the way, to inspire and equip people to follow her footsteps, she's created an excellent blog called Hit the Iron Bell. Anne-Marie, welcome.
Thanks so much. Pleasure to be here.
Let's start by asking you about your background, your early career in Australia, and why you came to the decision to launch into humanitarian work.
Yeah, so I grew up in Sydney on the east coast of Australia. It was a pretty regular sort of carefree childhood, playing with friends in the backyard, going to the beach, going camping. But when I look back at it, I think it's pretty clear that I was born basically with a bit of a craving for adventure and sort of instinctively hating routine. I remember even as a kid, I wanted to be a war correspondent. I would cut out articles from the world section of the newspaper. I would read books on these early female adventurers from centuries in the past who would go traipsing across the Middle East or climbing mountains, that sort of thing. So I think when I look back, I think there was sort of the seeds were there in terms of my personality for where I ended up. And also there was always a bit of a thread of wanting to make a difference. So I remember writing letters to the editor on climate change that my grandmother actually typed up on her typewriter at the time.
Fantastic.
Encouraged people to write letters, to argue for people who were unjustly imprisoned to be freed through Amnesty International, that sort of thing. So that they were sort of the early seeds. And then after school, I did a journalism degree and I started working as a newspaper journalist for a few years. And then I really sort of fell into politics by accident after that. So I worked as a media advisor for different ministers in the Labor Party, in state and then federal politics. And I'd really built, a very comfortable life. I lived 10 minutes walk from the famous Bondi Beach, going on hiking holidays overseas, brunches and dinners with friends, etc. But I remember I had this feeling that was growing stronger. I was sort of in my early 30s at this point, and I just had this feeling that I wasn't where I was supposed to be. I was a little bit off track. And I just had this really deep sense that I wanted to change careers into humanitarian or development work. I had been applying for a lot of roles without much success, and people who were in the industry told me you're really going to have to move overseas if you want to break in. It's going to be very hard from Sydney. So I felt so strongly about this, and I guess I had enough sort of courage and tolerance for risk-taking. So I quit my job in politics. I packed up my apartment, got on a flight to Jerusalem, and decided I was going to stay there to network and try to get my foot in the door.
What was the reaction from friends and family?
So I think a lot of people just kept telling me I was very brave. My parents said they were really proud of me, but to remember that if it didn't work out, I could always come back home. So, most people kind of responded with a bit of sort of incredulity and I guess admiration, but knowing that they would never do anything like that.
And how are you feeling in yourself? You were happy with that call and a bit excited and daunted at the same time, I assume?
Honestly, I was just excited. Like I say, it fed into this need for me to, shake things up, have a bit of variety, step outside of my comfort zones. So I was excited and I was just determined to put myself in the best situation to have the most chance of making the connections I needed and breaking in the door. And I had this sense that life is short and I didn't want to end up 80 years old and looking back and wondering what if. And I had this very strong sense that would be an absolute tragedy, and I wanted to avoid that regret of not having tried something.
So where did your career go from that point? How did it jump forward?
Yeah, so it basically it worked, So I found work initially as a volunteer and then with a bit of a salary working for UNRWA, the United Nations Agency for Palestine Refugees. And then I got a role with MSF, with Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, in Pakistan. I worked for the Food and Agriculture Organization in Nepal after the earthquakes, where we met or caught up again, and then in Myanmar after some floods, and then a bit of a stint working for the Fred Hollows Foundation in Australia and then with the UN in New York. So the lesson when I look back is that, I took that first step, I listened to my intuition, and now I can see how all those steps were made, all the future steps were made possible by that one move.
And it's quite a thing, isn't it? You jump forward and you can't see too much beyond, but then you have to have sort of a bit of faith that things will come, the next thing will come. Did you cope with those jumps okay?
I took a lot of reassurance, I think, along the way from the feeling I was getting of talking to and meeting people who were in the industry, the conversations I was having with them about the type of work they were doing, their motivations. It became very clear that I was surrounded by, I like to call it my tribe. Like I'd found my tribe, people who were adventurous, comfortable, living outside of their comfort zones and motivated by their a desire to live life according to their values and trying to make a bit of difference in the world. So I think that gave me more inspiration to keep going.
What are some of the other advantages of a life in development or humanitarian work?
Over and above everything else, I think I would highlight that point about fulfillment. Living a life that's true to yourself and finding work that aligns with your values, knowing that you're going to work every day and your colleagues are going to work every day to try to make the world a little bit fairer. That's a huge benefit. I often talk about those earlier years in Sydney as living in a very comfortable bubble. You would sort of spend time with a lot of the same people in the same circles, going to the same parts of town. But now through this work, I've had this privilege of connecting with people from all around the world who share their stories with me, take time to explain what it's like to live their lives, share meals or laugh. So it's those new perspectives and new experiences. And just the stimulation, again, of stepping out of your comfort zone, being exposed to different cultures and environments and seeing parts of the world that other people will never see.
So that all rings true for me, that being part of an international team with a focus, different skills, different backgrounds, but one goal.
Yeah.
It's a special feeling.
Yeah.
So they're the ups. What are some of the downsides of this life?
I like to speak really honestly about these because I think it's important for people to be aware. This is not necessarily the right fit for you if you think you're going to come in and change the world tomorrow. So one of the downsides is, that it is an imperfect system. There are some limitations and some challenges with the international system, with the UN system, with the NGO system. Of course, as we've seen most heartbreakingly with Gaza, as well as some of the other humanitarian crises. So humanitarians have been feeling that frustration, I guess, that the UN and international civil society haven't necessarily been able to do more to protect people, to enforce international humanitarian law. That imperfect system can be really tough. Of course, the trauma, and this is a very serious side to this work, the risk of experiencing PTSD, anxiety, depression. It's very, very common in this field of work for obvious reasons because of the types of trauma and injuries and threats that you see other people experiencing This was in 2015, so it was a few years ago now, but The Guardian did a survey of aid workers which found about 80% of the respondents had experienced a mental health issue, and 90% of those said that it was work-related. And I think there's a quote from a friend of mine who's a women's rights activist, an aid worker, an author called Lena Abirafe that really sums it up to me. She talks about being humanitarians being keepers of the world's tragedies. And she says, you can experience this, what she calls sort of activist fatigue and humanitarian depletion as you sit and watch, these are her words, sit and watch the mess being made over and over again.
So how do you cope with that? Because these things do happen again, don't they? The conflicts, the same people and fighting. How do you make sense of that and keep going?
It can be very tough from time to time. And I want to acknowledge that many of my colleagues and friends have experienced far more traumatic and stressful and difficult work environments and contexts than I have. But yes, first of all, you look after yourself as much as you can. You try to get sleep. You lean on your friends and family, get exercise. You regroup every day. You focus on what you can do, not only sort of sharing information with your networks about what's happening. So you're keeping different issues in the spotlight, even within your own little network. Come to work every day determined to remember why you're there and look for the opportunities to have as much impact as you possibly can. It's really tough.
I think if you believe that the work you're doing and the people around you wasn't being done, things would be worse.
That's it. That's 100%. Yeah, we see this. We've had the conversations with people in communities affected by humanitarian crises, by climate crises. You know that although there's always a lot more that can be done, the work that we are doing is helping people, and that is a reason to keep going.
I like the concept of the imperfect system. I've seen some development workers getting so frustrated and angry, and it's okay to feel that annoyance, but you've got to channel it and do something with it. Otherwise, it burns people up a bit.
Yeah, that's right. And I have friends reaching out to me on social media all the time asking what they can do in response to different crises. So I think it's trying to be a bit of a channel for people who want to do what they can as well. That all helps too.
Hit the iron bell. What are your tips for breaking into a UN agency role?
So Hit the Iron Bell is a source of really practical tips and advice for people who want to find work that aligns with their values and work for the UN or NGOs. It's got lots of really personal insights from people who have built careers in the industry and lots of very practical guidance on how you can prepare and then be as competitive as possible to get your foot in the door as quickly as possible. My top tips include the need to be strategic. So it's a massive tree with all sorts of different branches to it. So you need to think about what your personality is, what your values are, and what types of work and what types of industries and what types of countries or contexts might fit that. You need to prepare to be really brave. Take the leap. Think about yourself when you're 80 years old and try, if you're meant to be in this type of work, don't get caught in the comfort of routine and the security of your current job if you really feel like that's not where you're supposed to be. There's that Tim Ferriss quote that most people would rather be unhappy than uncertain. I also always really advise people to prepare. It is very competitive. So make sure that you're investing time in networking and nurturing those networks. Learn another language, volunteer. There are steps you can take to help yourself when you get to the application process. You need to persist. Many people spend a number of years working to get into this type of industry before they're successful. So it does take time. You have to be willing to accept that and stick it out, persist, and be flexible. You need to be willing to go where the needs are. And that might mean going where other people won't, but that's the way that you build your credibility, your expertise, and you learn from people who need help how they need the international community to be helping them.
Have many people who are mid-career reached out to you? They may be taking a pay cut or drawing in savings for a year or two to really realign themselves?
Yeah, definitely. I have people reaching out both in the middle of their sort of undergraduate or postgraduate studies, at the start of their careers, and also mid-career. For most of the mid-career people, they often have responsibilities. They might have, a lot of them have young children, for example, so they can't necessarily take a year off. But they talk through with me the ways that they can, as I say, like prepare, start investing in the particular sort of skills and qualifications that might help them, be more competitive, and think really carefully about the way they're structuring their CVs and cover letters, to cut through. And maybe there's shorter-term volunteer stints or consultancies that they might be able to do that fit with where they are at that stage in their lives. But I very strongly encourage people to still pursue this, even if they are mid-career. I did it. I've seen others do it. It's more than possible to do that, yeah.
And UN agencies need a wide variety of skills, right?
Yes.
They need lawyers, they need HR people, they need logistics experts, right through.
100%. And people hiring in the UN talk about this all the time. They're looking for the transferable skills. Like you say, there are jobs that are required in all the private sector companies that are also needed in every UN agency, like you say, HR, IT, logistics. And then there's the transferable skills, which you can lean into and promote when you're applying for these jobs. The communications, the collaboration, the partnership building. These are all skills that are very much needed by the UN as well.
Okay, so looking out over the next decade, what are the kind of things that you are expecting to see? Is technology going to make some huge wins and opportunities, or are we just going to be dealing with the impact of more climate change and all sorts of division and disinformation, etc., and conflict?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the challenges, yes, you mentioned climate change. Climate change and conflict, of course, are posing enormous challenges already for the work of the UN. Climate change, not only because of the more dramatic climate change related events like droughts or other sort of natural disasters, but also because in places like Nepal, for example, as temperatures rise, there's research to show that things like child marriage, for example, also are on the rise because the crops are not as productive, so families have less money, so therefore they're turning to measures like marrying their daughters young as a coping mechanism. So for all of those reasons, climate change and the impact on vulnerable communities is going to be huge. Conflict, of course, becoming more entrenched, more attacks on aid workers, harder for organisations to get access to the people they need to be supporting. And funding shortages is a huge one. Governments are committing less of their aid budgets to this type of work, and other sort of philanthropic and other partners are feeling very stretched across all the different conflicts and geopolitical dynamics. So that is making the work of the UN more difficult. You mentioned technology. So there's pros and cons. There are different types of weapons and technologies being used in warfare that are going to pose huge challenges. But there are also opportunities for AI and other forms of new technology that hopefully will make it easier to be more targeted and efficient in reaching the people who actually need help. So it's a bit of a mixed bag on that.
Yeah, I think you were on an Economist podcast recently, and they were talking about huge implications and improvements that could happen in Africa remote education and healthcare. So being able to get access to advice and class learning and tuition at a high level through AI was something very possible.
Yes.
It's exciting.
Yeah. Massive potential. And for anyone with skills or experience in that background, that could be a really interesting area of growth for them to offer their skills and experience to the UN or NGOs.
What's your recommendation for something worth a watch, a listen, or a read?
So I'm not going to point to a specific book or podcast. I'm just going to encourage people to take advantage of all the different panel discussions, guest speakers, etc., that are happening every day of the week, hosted by UN agencies, think tanks. They're a really rich source of sort of analytical thinking, information about what's actually happening on the ground. So look at things like your United Nations associations, your Brookings think tank, International Crisis Group, Women in Foreign Policy Group is a great one, United States Institute of Peace, etc. For anyone who's interested, even if you don't want to work in the industry, but you just want to learn more about these future trends and pressures on humanitarian work, tap into these. They're really inspiring and with lots of great speakers.
Thanks so much. All the best with your work here at the UN and, of course, with your blog. Thank you.
Thanks, pleasure.
Collab is a new podcast series from the International Development Unit at the New Zealand Science Institute, Plant and Food Research. Presented by me, Phil Johnstone, with original music by Miller Yule and editing by JD Lowe at Fratelli Media. For info about the impact of our Institute's international development work, visit plantandfoodresearch.com. And check out the show notes for links and how to send feedback and topic suggestions for future episodes. Thanks for listening. Till next time.